say something else, or I can just go on?
No, you're good. You're free to go, Helen.
Okay, very well. Done. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being so many. I can imagine that, of course, we had the first webinar, I think 2 years ago, and it was really an introduction on AI and international law. And this one, we were going for something a little bit more specific. So that is why we thought, okay, let's maybe discuss AI in military operations. And of course, the responsibility it can have when it comes to the acts of international criminal crimes. So now I would like to thank first Marta and Jonathan for being here today. So yeah, they're both experts on AI and military operations technologies. And of course, it has a big of an impact at the moment when it comes to international law. And I thought, okay, they would be probably very good to give their expertise in that topic. So first of all, I'd like to start with Marta. Thank you, Marta. And yeah, I'll leave you the floor.
Thank you very much, Helen, and thank you, for this invitation to speak today about AI military operations and accountability. It's a real good opportunity for me and my colleague Jonathan to go deep into criminal responsibility issues arising from the employment of these technologies in the battlefield. So let's try to move my slide. I don't know. Wait. Also, yesterday I had some issues. Okay, so just to give you a bit of an overview of the content of the session, I would like first to briefly outline which AI systems are we concerned with. And then I would like to discuss autonomous weapon systems and decision support systems, and then misidentification errors that could arise out of AI inaccuracy, but also errors stemming from human-machine interactions. So from humans interacting with these systems. And then I will zoom in on IHL violations that could result, and in particular, I will focus on distinction and indiscriminate attacks, since, as you all know, prosecution of violations of proportionality rules, so disproportionate attacks, are very, very difficult and very rare, especially at the international criminal law level. And then I will turn to war crimes that stem from these IHL violations and the challenges. So what are these AI systems in military operations that are we concerned with? First of all, autonomous weapon systems. For example, we could imagine armed drones equipped with automatic or autonomous target recognition systems with humans out of the loop. And I will explain in a bit what are the main elements of these systems. And then we have AI decision support systems, DSS, that, for example, assist military decision makers in target identifications, target nominations, target prioritization, such as, for example, this is some of the systems that have been used by Israel or have been used also in the war in Ukraine. So just want to show a picture of how it could look like an example of autonomous weapon systems, AWS, the drone that I just mentioned. But let's turn to the characteristics of these systems. So the characteristics of autonomous weapon systems have been debated for a long time, and also have been the cause of a very long stalemate in the debates around regulatory instruments. But they basically come down to the fact that these systems function and are based on pre-programmed encoded target profiles, such as features of enemy tanks. And then these systems, how they work is that they basically match inputs that they collect from sensors from the environment, and they match those inputs against the target profile that has been pre-programmed. And then eventually, finally, they engage targets without human assessment of those inputs, so humans out of the loop. The main feature of these systems is that there is autonomy in the application of force in target engagements. There is a level of unpredictability. And by this, I basically mean that the targeters do not know exactly which tank will be targeted, when, and where. So here we're not talking about an autonomous decision-making of the machine in itself, but there is a level of lack of knowledge around the when and where and the what will be targeted. And then there is also a temporal aspect that I would like to highlight, that basically through the pre-programming of target profiles, some decisions that are relevant to targeting are taken at the development stage of these systems. So features of enemy tanks or combatant uniforms and their features are pre-programmed. So there is a temporal gap between these decisions that are pre-programmed and pre-inputted at the development phase and the moment of the attack. Now, let's turn to decision support systems. And here I'm showing you two pictures. One refers to one of the systems, the gospel used reportedly used by Israel in Gaza, and the second one is a platform developed by Palantir that assists military decision makers targeting a variety of functions, type of weapon, information, situational awareness about the situation on the ground. Is my connection okay? Can you hear me properly? Okay, because I received them. Okay, sorry. These systems process a large amount of information, drone footage, intelligence, satellite images, communications. And based on this processing of information, provide different ranges of knowledge to those in charge of the targeting processes, including recommendation about targets, their locations, target nomination, and target prioritization. The difference here is that autonomy, AI, is not necessarily in the application of force, but is rather in other phases of the targeting cycle, and humans are in the loop. So this system provides recommendations to targeters that then take decisions based on these AI-led recommendations. And these systems also pose different questions in relation to compliance with IHL and possible war crimes. Let's now move to IHL and to the cardinal rule of distinction. As you all know, the principle of distinction imposes to parties to the conflict the obligation to distinguish at all time between the civilian population and combatants, and between civilian objects and military objectives. and accordingly to direct military operation only against military objectives. The key concern of the principle of distinction is around target identification. Distinction is very much about target identification. So the question is, can AI support this task? When it comes to target identification, it is important to consider possible misidentification errors that could be dependent on the target type and on how AI performs in relation to different potential target types. So AI could perform rather well in object recognitions, and especially such a tank, and especially in relation to objects whose features do not change during the armed conflict, or more broadly in relation to military objective whose status is rather static during the armed conflict, such as military objectives by nature. When it comes to targeting to AI accuracy in relation to, and parentheses, these type of uses are much more debated and much more problematic. But we could imagine AI performing rather accurately in relation to combatants in uniforms. However, let's also keep in mind that there are environmental conditions or other arms-related factors that could impact the accuracy in these cases, such as smoke, camouflage, concealment. But in these two examples, AI could potentially perform and performs rather accurately. There are, however, situations that requires more contextual evaluations, but also evaluations that need to be done in proximity to the attack. So when we think about military objectives by use, location, and purpose, this requires evaluations that are more contextual, that depend on the use of a certain object that per se is not of a military nature, such as a pickup, for example. Also, when it comes to targeting people, evaluations of civilians directly participating in hostilities are much more problematic. They require an interpretation of intent, interpretation of behavior that needs to be done much closer to the attack. Also, in the example that I just mentioned about recognizing combatants in uniforms, we have to remember that their status, their targetability is not static. Their status can change. For example, when they surrender, they're not targetable anymore, or more generally, when of course they combat. So in all these situations, the potential for error is much larger. There are also other causes for errors, such as bias. We can discuss this more in depth in the Q&A. But let's think, for example, about a system that has been trained on data that have not been updated, and did not reflect maybe the situation on the ground, and did not reflect, for example, the presence of people with disabilities on the ground. A system that has not been trained on data that reflect the actual situation can fail to identify, can fail to detect protected people on the ground, and therefore lead to potential violations of IHL. There are also other factors that could influence the accuracy of these systems. The environment, armed conflict is highly unpredictable environment, is a dynamic environment. Also, there could be adversarial attack. Sorry for the typo in the slides. And also failures, mechanical failures of these systems. But here the question is, do misidentification errors amount to war crimes? And we will turn to this question in a bit. Also, as I mentioned, that we could have misidentifications that stem and derived from a combination of AI errors and human errors, what I call human-machine interaction derived mistakes. And here the issue arises especially with decision support systems. As I mentioned earlier, with decision support systems, we have humans in the loop. So the obligation to take precautions in attack is key here. The duty to take precautions in attack essentially contains a series of steps that commanders and those planning an attack have to follow upon the launch of an attack, such as the duty to verify targets, the obligation to cancel or suspend an attack when it is apparent that it will violate distinction and proportionality. However, the speed and scale to which decision support systems operate, but also the lack of understandings on the part of human operators and human decision makers of the type of recommendation that the system provides, could make it more difficult to comply with the duty to take precautions in attack and to follow all these steps that are made mandatory by this provision. Also, there is the issue of automation bias that could lead to over-reliance on these systems, that could make it more difficult compliance with these obligations. And a question here is war crime. So the statute definition of the war intentionally directing attacks against civilians in the civilian populations. Here, the mens rea standard for this war crime is very, very stringent. It's a very
fundraiser in 1 year. Okay.
Sorry, I'm muting.
I think there was yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's okay. Okay. So we have a very, very high mens rea threshold for the war crime of directing attack against the civilian population, which basically has been interpreted as direct intent and indirect intent. So dolus directus in the first degree and dolus directus in the second degree. Dolus eventualis, as you all know, has been excluded by under the Rome Statute as a possible mens rea standard in general, and also especially for this crime. However, the most likely scenario with autonomous weapon systems and with decision support systems, as we just discussed, is a scenario of lack of intent, AI mistakes, human-machine interaction-derived mistakes, including over-reliance of these systems over decision support systems. At best, these scenarios could be qualified as recklessness, and so as a form of risk-taking behavior. But whether recklessness is a mens rea for conduct of hostilities crimes under the Rome Statute, this has been excluded. Under the ICCBA case law, it has been accepted, and it could be relevant under national criminal law systems. So here we have an issue with the mens rea, with the proof of mens rea. Then continuing on a problem of intent, negligence is not a mens rea standard. So failure to take precautions in attack, such as verify targets, suspend or cancel an attack, are not war crimes. Failure to take precaution in attacks could be considered in the as relevant element to prove intent, and this is something on which my colleague Jonathan will elaborate more upon. And ultimately also there is the issue of mistake of there is a potential defense of mistake of fact that could be invoked. So lack of knowledge about the civilian character of the target could negate the intent. So how the defense of mistake of facts operates and will play out in these prosecutions, I think it's something that needs to be considered. Also, the principle of the IHL rule on distinction is not only about target identifications and not only about prohibiting direct attacks against civilians, but is also about prohibiting indiscriminate attacks. In IHL, we have this rule in Article 51, paragraph 4 of AP1. The key concern around indiscriminate attacks is target specificity and the limitation of effects of attacks. So this prohibition is concerned with attacks that are not directed against a specific military objectives, weapons that are indiscriminate by natures, and means and method of warfare that whose effect cannot be limited. It's important to highlight a few points around this provision. This is first of all the most likely war crime that could be potentially committed with these systems, while direct attacks are less likely. However, it's not codified under the Rome Statute as a standalone war crime. So indiscriminate attacks as violation of the principle of distinctions are not codified under Article 8 as standalone, but the case law of the ICC has been subsumed. These war crimes has been considered subsumed under the war crime of directly attacking the civilian population. However, the mens rea is rather different. On the one hand, for direct attacks against civilians, we have intent. It's very much about intentionally directing attacks against protected individuals and objects under IHL. When it comes to the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks, the mens rea is rather one of risk-taking behavior in a way. So it's about targeters using weapons whose effects whose effects are indiscriminate, or launching attacks in situations where civilians are intermingled with combatants. So it's a rather different subjective attitude in the attack. Finally, common responsibility. So common responsibility, so up until now we have discussed, I've been giving an overview of criminal law issues applicable and linked to direct perpetration of war crimes. Let's now move to other modes of responsibility. Common responsibility has been considered a sort of panacea in a way, a sort of the go-to mode of responsibility to kind of solve the accountability gaps that could arise from the problems that I just highlighted. Here, there has been some different approaches in doctrines in terms of to what and to whom we need to apply responsibility. So are we concerned with the superior subordinate relationship among a commander and the autonomous weapons itself, or instead we should construe command responsibility as traditionally understood as applicable to a superior and a human subordinate that employs autonomous weapon systems. So for some scholars, let's put it this way, autonomous weapon systems have been sort of anthropomorphized. Okay, this is a difficult word, but you get what I mean. And have been wrongly, in my view, applied and considered command responsibility applicable directly to the weapon systems. Regardless of this, there are several questions concerning mens rea that could still be problematic to kind of prove in light. And even though here we have a lower mens rea standard equiparable to negligence, it could still be quite difficult for commanders to understand and to know the effects and behavior of these systems. So even though it could potentially provide solutions, it still poses some questions in relation to the elements of mens rea superior subordinate relationship. Finally, I think this is a question that is often asked, is whether what is the potential criminal responsibility of developers and programmers. As I mentioned at the beginning of my presentations, because of these pre-programming aspects that autonomous weapons, but also decision support systems have, in the sense that some decisions relevant to targeting are pre-programmed. So what is the role of developers? And here, just a few points for considerations. To prove war crimes, we need a nexus with the armed conflict. So the question is, under what condition would this nexus be satisfied? There is a problem of link with the attack. Can we consider some developers' actions and act as preparatory acts? How far back in time an attack would start? Does it start already when we are pre-programming and pre-inputting these target profiles in these systems? But to me, the real question is whether we can identify a sort of causal control. What is the causal influence that this pre-programming of target profiles have on the behavior and effects of these military systems? So this brings to an end my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to the discussion with you. And yes, just to mention that please feel free to reach out to Aser and to all my colleagues. We organize courses on this topic, and yeah, we would be very glad to have more conversation with this expert community. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marta. That's great because you already answered some of my questions, so that was very good. Thank you. Now, Jonathan is going to talk about a linked topic. So, as he named it, so his topic will be playing dumb. Does AI provide more opportunities to deny guilty knowledge? So, thank you very much, Jonathan. I will leave you the floor.
Thank you so much, Elen, for the invitation. And also thank you, Marta, for the excellent intro that provides a great baseline on many of the related topics. Why does AI make mistakes? Why is it difficult to predict if AI makes mistakes? But also what implications this has for mens rea and other elements required for criminal responsibility. So given that this very solid baseline has already been provided, I thought, well, let's exploit this to engage you, all of the participants present here, with a more specific argument. And I'm going to invite you to join me for a thought experiment that I'm going to perform. And this will hopefully also make some of the difficult points that Marta already introduced a bit more concrete. But perhaps it will also introduce a bit more concerns related to the argument that I'm going to present, which hopefully you can see now. Can you?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. Okay, so this is the provocative title of my presentation, and the main argument that I'm going to try to convince you of today is this: that AI in a military setting provides its users with more opportunities to avoid guilty knowledge of any harm that might arise from its use. So this is the situation that Marta just explained, where an AI is deployed and then it causes an actus reus or a prohibited effect. But then the question is, can you then link this to the mental state of a human user who was involved with deploying the system? And let's establish a baseline first. So imagine this is the general scenario that we're working with, where, for example, you have a base commander who decides to green light one of the two systems that Marta just introduced. So on one hand, you have a drone. This drone goes and searches for tanks. It finds a tank and shoots it. Or the commander green lights a DSS, so a decision support system. This decision support system gives targeting advice, for example, to a human operator, and this operator then chooses to engage a particular target. In this situation, again, a tank. So this is how you would like it to be. Of course, this is not so interesting from a criminal law perspective. So let's change it a bit to this context, where you have the same situation where two systems are used, but now these systems glitch. So the drone sees the car as a tank and starts attacking it, for example. Not great, huh? You're attacking civilians. Or the targeting advisor gets confused, it starts hallucinating, for example, and advises a human person that, hey, in that building, there's a military stockpile there based on all the intelligence we've received. And the human operator decides to attack in good faith, and it turns out to be a civilian building, for example. Now, in this situation, this is, of course, more interesting from a criminal law perspective. But I'd like to draw your attention to, so there are two things going on here. First is there is this glitch going on in the AI system, which I've represented with the red thunderbolt. But there is also this component of, often in these situations, the humans actually are unaware of what exactly went wrong. And sometimes they might be unaware that something did go wrong at all. And these two baselines I'm going to use to then build my argumentation. So let's first start with the red lightning bolt. So what exactly went wrong? Now, Marta already gave a very nice introduction as to the different things that can go wrong with an AI system. But in this context, I think it's particularly interesting to consider that, at least in my view, you can divide these causes into two types. You have either one-time accidents or you have systemic problems. And I divide these into these two categories because their consequences are very different. So when I talk about a one-time accident, you can think about an isolated anomaly. So the drone is flying around. There is a reflection from a wall that bounces against a church window, for example, and that hits the camera with a specific angle, and it glitches and it attacks a civilian car, for example. This is a very specific convergence of circumstances that is unlikely to happen again. Or you can think of a mishap. Well, mishaps happen all the time with weapons, and then you don't immediately go after the operator and say you committed a war crime, because obviously mishaps do happen. Or perhaps the mistake of the AI was within the expected margin of failure. I think this is often important to emphasize that AI can never be 100% perfect. It can be 99.99, for example, but it can never be 100. So operators will have to deal with this by deciding, okay, knowing that my AI might make mistakes, do I still want to use it? And this is the same process that you do with artillery, for example. You know there is a circular error probable, but you decide, okay, I think it is fine to use this. It is not discriminate. It's precise enough. I know it might go wrong, but I accept that risk. And again, you don't prosecute these people for war crimes, obviously. And then you have system failures, where just you can think of a small mechanical failure. There was a small production error here, and all of these factors converge into creating an accident, for example. Now, these are one-time accidents in the sense that if an AI indeed makes this error, it was justifiable from the operator's perspective, and I argue it is justifiable for the operator to continue using the system, because this was not a systemic issue with the system where it is systemically unable to distinguish, for example, but it was just a one-time problem. And you can contrast this with what I call systemic causes of error on the right. So think about an undiscovered fatal edge case. So like I said, AI can never be 100% perfect, but they're also very brittle. So for example, an AI trained in an urban setting functions very well, perhaps in the urban setting. But then if you suddenly bring it to a desert, it might work very poorly because it was not trained for that situation. So that is what you see there, concept drift and data drift. So the concept was for this situation, but the actual data that goes into the AI is a completely different environment. And that causes the performance to drop dramatically. Now, in this case, I would say, yes, then you definitely need to retire the AI, because it is foreseeable that if you use this system again in the same desert, for example, then it will glitch again. So there is this element of foreseeability, which you need for the mental element, obviously. Or you can think of the undiscovered fatal edge case, which I mentioned before. So, for example, an AI might associate particular hats or particular helmets with the person being a combatant, even though, for example, it is a regional dress that is often being used in that region. Now, if the AI has never been tested in that region, then the operator will never know that this is an edge case until it is actually deployed in this situation. And then you know, oh, well, it systemically misidentifies these hats as being military helmets, for example, and then start shooting all of the villages. And in this case, you also want to retire the system, obviously. These systems are also very frequently updated. Usually it goes well, but sometimes these updates can introduce a glitch. Now, if you know that the update was misaligned, then of course you don't want to keep using the system, and you also want to retire the fleet. And the problem is, in practice, it is really hard to determine if a particular incident is caused by the left side or by the right side, because this is the reason why I say that, is because AI are very, very difficult to grasp. And this is the second element. So you have these four elements that I'm going to discuss with you briefly. But basically, the point is that if you're an actual operator in the field, even if you got some technical training into AI, it is very hard to distinguish between left or right in this situation. So let's start with the fact that modern AI is a black box. You've probably heard this, but what does it mean? Well, very easily, you know what it's going to do a majority of the time, but you often don't know what it's going to do in a specific context. And one of the reasons for this is just to give you an illustration, is that it's very high dimensional thinking. So for example, if you look at the top right there, you see green circles and red circles, and then you see a decision boundary. Now, if I give you a new circle and I put it somewhere, so let's say I put it on the top left of the left graph. So I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this one. Well, then you know that the system is going to classify it as a red dot because the decision boundary is quite clear. This is a two-dimensional picture. Now, the down there, you see a three-dimensional picture. Now it's already not so easy. If I give you a parameter of 0, 2, 1.5, can you tell me very easily if it falls to the left or to the right of the decision boundary? A bit more difficult. Now imagine these modern AI systems have like 50 dimensions, 70 dimensions. Impossible for our human brains to understand. The second problem is that often these glitches are very unintuitive and sometimes bizarre. So this happened multiple times with Teslas that you can see on the screen here, where if they see a white truck from the side, then they think it is the sky. So then they keep driving and hit the truck. I give you this example because this is an example of a systemic problem because it happens all the time, as you can see here. But if you only have one data point, so I just tell you a Tesla crashed into the side of a white truck last week, for example, would you be able to tell me if this was a freak accident, this convergence of circumstances, or that this is a systemic glitch? It's very difficult. You only know if it happens a few times. And it's also quite bizarre, the problem, the errors that AI can make. So it's even difficult to predict in advance what it's going to do. So here I give you an example to the left, again from a Tesla, where there is a person stumbling, he's crossing the street. And at the moment he is on the floor, the car thinks he's a cat, as you can see there. And it's quite confident that this person is a cat. It's 88% confidence. And in this case, he would just step on the gas and hit the person. Another example to the right. So this is the red part you see there is a prompt entered into GPT. And if you make this nonsense prompt, because this isn't even a sentence, right? But if you enter this nonsense prompt, then you can cause the GPT to become super racist, as you can see there. And it starts rambling like crazy. So no one can predict this. So it's also often also difficult for commanders to be able to predict specifically what their system is going to do. Usually they only know that it's going to work a majority of the time. Also, and Marta already mentioned this, adversaries can change their tactics. So these are two examples where people deliberately plaster like stickers on stop signs. And if you look at the right stop sign, for us humans, we still can see it's a stop sign, obviously. But if you look at down there, what the machine thinks, now suddenly the machine isn't so confident anymore that this is a stop sign. In fact, the machine now thinks that it's a 100 kilometer per hour sign. And what I want to show, and to the right is also very funny. So these two gentlemen, they printed out a nonsense pattern, as you can see there. And if you hold it in front of you, then a facial recognition system doesn't see you anymore. You become invisible, as you can see there. And what I want to say with this is that your adversaries can systemically change their tactics. So a system that previously worked perfectly can suddenly not work perfectly for factors completely out of your control. It's the enemy that changes their behavior. And you might not know that the enemy is changing their behavior. Finally, and this is specific to military systems, the feedback loop is extremely slow. So I've given you multiple times, I've mentioned, well, you only know if it falls in the left or the right category of errors if you see it a few times. Well, this seeing it a few times is very hard in a military context because often you don't have access to the operational environment. ISR, so intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance assets are being used elsewhere. So often, and this is a great paper by Una Hathaway, she says that after action reviews only happen weeks, months afterwards. Well, what if this after action review would have allowed you to determine that your system is not working as well as you thought, for example? So in that case, if this after-action review, like the one that I'm arguing for here in this paper, where you have a very robust system of horizontal reporting between operators, signaling that, hey, my drone did something weird, and then this gets passed to other colleagues, this gets passed upwards to the operator. If you do this, then maybe you can determine that, oh yeah, there is something systemically wrong with this system. But with the way it currently is, it's very hard because often commanders don't even know if their missile landed correctly. So these two things at the same time, I argue, facilitate the possibility of users of AI systems to remain ignorant longer of the problems with their systems, which has impacts for mens rea, obviously. So let me give you this thought experiment, where you have this gentleman, D0. He launches drones, and these drones are supposed to strike tanks. Super reliable, as you can see here. So they've experienced 0 errors in the past half year. Now, in this specific sortie, however, suddenly the drones inexplicably targeted civilian trains. Now, D0 asks technicians to quickly determine what's the problem, and they find out and they tell him that the most recent weekly update introduced glitches. Now, D0 really wants to take the city, so the next day he uses the same drones in the same area. What's going to happen? I think it's quite obvious for all of us. The drones are going to target more trains. And they do this, and they kill and injure many civilians. So how do you analyze this from a mens rea perspective? Well, I would argue, at least, for the first incident, it's a bit difficult to establish a guilty mental state. I would argue that a person in this context, at least, would be entitled to rely on the excellent track record of these drones, like 0 errors in the past half year. And there have been many updates, and none of which have been problematic. So there was nothing to put D0 on notice that there was a risk here. But obviously, the next day, he still uses the same drones, knowing that there was a glitch caused by the update. Well, then at least I would say there is recklessness, maybe even dolus indirectus. Now, let me contrast this with this one. So here is D1, and she is in the exact same situation, and in the same situation where the drones targeted trains. However, this is a black box AI. So it's very hard for D1 to know exactly what went wrong, to put it either in the left or the right category. She asks her technicians to find out what's going on, but it takes time. This analysis is difficult. And while the analysis is underway, D1 gets a missive to capture a nearby village. She's a bit concerned, like, these systems acted strangely yesterday. But then, based on the reporting, it turns out, well, there is no trains in the village. And there is some operational pressure, as you can see here. So, fine, D1 decides to use the drones because there are no trains. And this time, very bizarrely, the drones swarm and bombard an innocuous office building. So how would you analyze this in terms of mens rea? Well, the first incident is the same. The context is the same. There is no mens rea in my view. But the second incident, compared to the previous D0, where I argue there's at least recklessness, is there some guilty mind here? Because does the fact that the drones previously targeted trains in a city context give you enough notice to be able to predict, to a certain extent, that these drones would pose danger to a building in the village where there is no trains? I think it's difficult. And if I were the lawyer of D1, I would definitely argue that way. So what happened in this context? Why did the drones attack a building? Well, it was actually this logo that was the culprit. So this very specific orange and blue logo causes the drones to hallucinate. This logo is on the trains, but it is also on that office building, because that's the central office building of this railway company that operates in the region. So a commander would only know that there is a specific risk to this office building in the village if you have exact knowledge of why the drones made the hallucination. So if you know that there is an orange and blue logo cause of error, then, as you can see in the top right, you can make the mental inference that, okay, if I use this in the village now, then it will attack the building, which I think is enough for mens rea. But if you only have approximate knowledge, I think it's a bit more difficult, because the lawyer can always argue that, well, my client was aware that these targets, that the misidentified targets were trains, and she took precautions not to use it again in the city. How could she have known that it would attack the building? And this really strikes to the heart of what I argue here in one of my papers using this graph, where there is this long gap between a notice where it gives the person a notice that something might be off. So there might be either a one-time issue or a systemic issue, but you don't know which one it is without the inquiry, which is this long horizontal stretch here. If you reach the posterior knowledge phase, so to the right, then you arrive at this with exact knowledge situation, where you know exactly that it is this orange and blue logo. But if any time before reaching this point, you use the drones again, I would argue that you are still in this approximate knowledge phase with a much weaker mens rea vis-a-vis the second incident. And the problem is that this inquiry bridge is quite difficult to cross. As you saw, it's often quite cumbersome because you need to get technicians in. It takes a while. It might be operationally hindersome because D1 has already pushed, please capture that village. And sometimes you even never get an answer. So even AI technicians sometimes cannot find out what exactly went wrong because there's not enough data, for example. And if you're a bit skeptical and saying, well, what's the difference between this and other types of mishaps and weapons? Well, there is a very significant difference because in traditional non-AI accidents, it is very easy to skip from the notice phase to the posterior knowledge phase. So it's very easy to reach this with exact knowledge situation. For example, you have a GPS-guided missile. You launch the missile, and suddenly it falls on a hospital, for example. It was not your intention. You do a bit of investigation, and you decide, and you find out, okay, well, the GPS signal was being jammed by the enemy, and they're still jamming it. Well, that is enough for one to skip from the notice phase to the posterior knowledge phase. You know now that if you use the munition again, that it will malfunction again because you know what caused the malfunction. It's the GPS. So as long as the GPS signal isn't there, the missile will act indiscriminately. Enough for mens rea, I would say. But for AI, it's much more difficult you need to get technicians on board. You might need to call someone from the company who made the AI. Computer scientists may have to apply an explainable AI solution to it to determine what exactly went wrong. And sometimes you never get an answer. So this bridge is harder to cross in an AI situation. And this, I argue, creates undesirable incentives. So imagine D2 and D3, who are in exactly the same situation as D1. But here, instead of trying to bridge their knowledge via this inquiry phase, D2 deprioritizes it. Because D2 thinks, well, if I know, then it will cause me to hesitate in upcoming operations. It's not so nice. And then you can go through all the way down to even less and less scrupulous scrupulous reasons for not pursuing the inquiry. So, for example, D3 here is knows somewhat about the law and thinks, well, if I keep my mens rea as low as possible, so my mental state as low as possible, then I have more opportunities to deny knowledge later. So D3 blocks her subordinates from proceeding with the analysis. Now, you might argue that, well, this doesn't seem like best practice, right? Isn't this some sort of violation of the duty of precautions, for example? Yes, perhaps. But like Marta mentioned, failing in your duty of precaution, so I would say going through the inquiry route, so bridging this gap, or establishing very strong post-action inquiry methods, assigning a lot of ISR assets to determine if your AI worked fine or not, is a precautionary measure. I would not argue that this is part of the indiscriminate rule or of the proportionality rule, for example, which do have crimes attached to them. So that is the thought experiment that kept me busy for a while, and which eventually led to a paper. And so this small presentation was kind of like the cliff notes of this paper. The paper is the one to the left. If you're interested in reading, you can take a screenshot of this, and you see the QR code there. And if you're interested, you can read it. Also, I've written relatedly to this on this iterative assessment process, more from an IHR perspective. So saying that proper execution of precautions would imply this assigning all of these ISR assets and having this strong after-action mechanism to determine if your AI is still working correctly or not. But again, this is not a war crime, not doing this. So that's the gap that I've identified. I've done a bit more other works. So here is another QR code in case you're interested in reading more works of mine, amongst others, as you can see, also on accountability and AI systems. And with that, I thank you, and I'm very interested in hearing your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. It is very interesting indeed, especially because then the difference between the D0, D1, D2, D3, indeed you can think, okay, there are certain situations where even when a decision would have been made by a human, then you can imagine that, okay, what is the difference with a decision that has been made or has been facilitated through an AI tool? So the others, indeed, do you just continue and then you use that lack of knowledge as well? I'm not going to make myself guilty and not go further with my decision. So thank you very much. Yeah, I would like to maybe move now to the questions. I have a couple of my own, but maybe anybody else in the audience has questions as well that they would like to ask the speakers. You can either raise your hand or also write it down in the chat. I will gladly read it for you, whatever you prefer. No? Okay. Oh, yes, go ahead, Kimberly.
Hello, thank you all for your presentation. I really, really appreciate it, and I always love learning about this. My question is this: I have a case involving war crimes victims, which a government has acknowledged, and the military personnel were involved in that. I'm having trouble trying to find any reference materials in terms of trying to figure out how to assess damages for my victims in order to know what to properly negotiate. The victims were in a conflict zone in Afghanistan, and the government is in Australia. So I don't know how to assess. So I was wondering, do you have any recommendations of reading materials I can look at to sort of see how to potentially assess damages on behalf of my victims?
So just to make clear, you're looking for AI tools that could help you with assessing damages.
Yes, if there's any. I was sort of looking if there's a way to calculate that, and the best that I've come up with is sort of looking at civil damages for personal injury claims. I don't know, but I just didn't know if, I know this is probably beyond the AI sort of scope of things, but I just thought it might be relevant because it's involving, I was sort of looking at your materials, which I'm going to definitely order some of your books. So thank you. Because it's military personnel involved in the war crimes, I wasn't sure if you may know or have any recommendations for what books I can read on damage assessments for victims. I'm sorry if this is beyond your scope, but I thought everyone I've talked to I haven't been able to get any good recommendations. So
We can look it up for you, Kimberly. I think it's not really like within our scope of study and research at the moment, but we will keep your question in mind. We have colleagues, I think, at Aster working on victims reparation damages more general. So we can stay in touch on this.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe you can actually write us an email with the specific question, and then we can refer you to our colleague who's definitely, well, hopefully able to help you.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anybody else, or shall I
I
read?
see.
Yeah.
Okay. I see a question from Marina, if I can. So she's asking, can we include the evidence of false incentives, taking precautions, witness knowledge? Yes, I think so. So this is my position actually, which is that yes, it is true that lack of precautions is not a war crimes, but it is the strongest element that we have to prove mens rea. So in practice, it is so difficult to prove mens rea for these crimes that basically understanding what precautions exactly would require in these cases, including ex post facto post-strike assessments, it's very important to then take those as elements to prove possible knowledge or intent. I don't know if you want to follow up, Jonathan.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I was very, very thankful for you for your critique on my paper, because that's something I missed. Where indeed the biggest problem is that I identified in my argument is that failing to do the inquiry phase and failing to do the after action assessment is a precautionary measure instead of a war crime. But if, for example, you have a commander who systemically refuses to investigate their systems, who systemically refuses to implement any kind of after action mechanism, I think you can definitely infer some kind of mens rea from there. Yes.
Thank you. Now I will try to, I'm not sure that I understand the question of Meridoc. So is it possible to use AI itself to calculate the amount of error and therefore possible culpability, mens rea in particular incidents?
That's interesting. So, okay, let's imagine what this would look like. So, for example, you have an incident, and you have an incident with a drone, and you want to know what the error rate was of the drone post factum, if I understand the question correctly. Is this the scenario you had in mind? Because often you don't have access to the system, obviously. The victim doesn't have access to the system. Investigators probably don't have access to the system. And the system might have changed afterwards.
Yeah, because I was...
I can unmute myself. So I was trying to be more efficient by typing it out, but I appreciate it wasn't as clear a question as it could have been. I'm just thinking that you've outlined that there were so many different dimensions or variables in these issues. It's beyond sort of human comprehension. So given that it's an AI system we're concerned with and the power of AI, can't we harness AI to police itself to some extent? And if we put in the commands of the system saying that these are the limitations, it must respect X and Y basic laws of rules of conflict, then it will find the errors quicker than we could. And if it polices itself, it could sort of set limitations on AI's operations before they begin.
You want to take this, Marta, or? Well, this is a good point, and as long as you have somewhat good faith actors involved, I think this is a very good solution. Actually, I'm not sure if AI can go that far in terms of that you automate the whole process of implementing IHL. I also think this is a bit dangerous because then you go into the realm of anthropomorphization. While international law obviously binds states and the actors of the states, not the tools. But I think you can harness AI capabilities to some extent to increase compliance. So, for example, one of the things I've once argued for is that you can include a self-reporting mechanism in an AI where all of the data that goes into a particular decision and that goes into a particular strike, for example, is logged. So then you already have the input and output pairs of what exactly happened. And then you can even have an extra algorithm that determines, well, something might have gone wrong here. And then it sends a report to the commander, for example. Watch out, something might have gone wrong. I think that would go a long way into reducing this feedback loop problem that I mentioned. Because if you reduce the feedback loop, then there is also less chance of commanders being able to say, well, I had no idea.
Yeah, maybe just try. So I think it's an interesting point, but it's more about whether this is technically possible to actually have an AI system able to calculate the amount of error, because usually the issue that we discuss is rather one of amplification and perpetuations of mistakes until a human basically detects it. So here I think we are discussing the opposite thing. So the AI system self-detecting the errors and kind of correcting. So I don't know if this is like a technically feasible, but it's for sure something that if technically feasible could be at least let's say stop perpetuation of these continuous errors. But normally the issue is framed through the opposite lens, so amplification of errors until we as humans detect it, because this is how AI essentially works. But yeah, maybe this is something to be discussed with tech people.
Thank you. Yeah, I had maybe one last question that we can answer. I don't know if there is anybody else in the audience that wanted to ask one last question.
Juan Carlos, I see.
Oh, thanks so much. I appreciate so much your both presentations. Really, really very, very strong, clear, and complete. And I only have and want to share some general commentary, because I think we have to put our interest firstly ex ante, before the criminal context or the international law context. Because I'm thinking during your presentations about criminal liability for the products, because developers, designers, and the private organizations generally are creating AI weapons before the war conflicts. Then, generally, from the practice, on the practice point of view, generally, these organizers, these developers are advising or have advisors from the militaries, armies, normally, I think, retired generals, high officials, high commanders with a very lot of experience in the field or in the theory of the field. So we can hope from this and wait from these people before the possibility to preview the default of organizations, default of malfunctioning on the expanded node appreciate results before the weapons designs. Maybe we have to think this problem firstly inside the United Nations Prohibited Guns or Arms Commission, to study the possibility to list the situation that if you cannot offer a very proof product, you cannot sell. Because in my experience, when you are advising some militarist groups or experts, our militaries only buy inside the very close market some products with certifications. But the problem is who made these certifications. I think we have lawyers and lecturers or researchers. Maybe we have to combine the international product liability with the criminal international liability, because it's very possible. Ex post facto, consider this situation like a very combining very high level degrees of combining or combine criminal liability. This is my commentary for all of you. Thanks so much for your patience.
It's a very good point. There are a number of initiatives, right, Jonathan, going towards certifications, also kind of insurance protocols. But you are highlighting a very important point, Juan Carlos, that in this specific domain, the influence that private sectors have in the development and in the programming, in the conceptualization of all these products, it's very different from any other kind of weapon sectors that we saw, and the impact that they have on the decision making on it is completely different. And so what you're suggesting makes a lot of sense, to combine product liability and use it also like with criminal liability, and use lack of certification or of other standards for the private sector also like as a sort of proof of responsibility. Because up until now it's very much based on a discourse of the responsabilization of private companies. So they present themselves as a simple, basically, serving the customer's needs, but this is not the reality. So thank you for your comment.
Also to add, I just pasted a link in the chat that people might be interested in watching, in opening, because so this is an initiative by Damien Copeland. He's been in this field for a long time, and one of his main critiques was exactly like this point, where there is this gap between industry-led innovation and review processes and certification. So what he did with this initiative, I think it's really brilliant. Is actually he created some like a matrix that he invites states and individual industries to certify based on how responsible they are in terms of legal, ethical, and other requirements. And then, like if you buy an appliance, you get this kind of like star rating. And the idea by this is because there is so little actual initiative from states to do this, that we can have kind of like a popular naming and shaming situation where if you don't self-certify, you don't get a lot of stars, then it might be that states might not be as interested in buying from you because you are seen as an irresponsible industry actor, for example. So this is just to show, I agree completely with we should combine product liability, criminal liability, state responsibility, but like this soft type of responsibility is also something that some actors in the field are considering. So like combining all of these efforts is great, I think.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So I would like to conclude this this webinar. Thank you again, Marta. Thank you, Jonathan. I will put some links to the publications that you've had, Jonathan, as well. It's basically going to be your website. There are a lot of articles that have been written. There's also a book. So please, feel free to read them. They're very interesting. Marta has also written a lot of articles. One of them is a pretty they're pretty recent ones when it comes to not just military operations, but it's also, for example, when it comes to prosecution of international crimes and the biases and what you need to pay attention to when you are an investigator or part of the prosecution team in the defense. So I'll put them now in. So this is the link for Jonathan and Marta. I was trying to get your link. I hope it also works.
Yeah, it's not very updated, I must admit, but I can share a few publications. So thank you so much for offering us this space. Please reach out to us. As said, we are working on these topics from different angles and organizing courses, but also we would welcome very much increased collaboration with this, with you as expert in this field. So, and thank you, Aden, for convening this.
Of course, thank you very much. Well, then I wish everybody a nice evening. We're probably gonna do additional webinars in the future, still in that field, and of course more in the prosecution of international crimes. So yeah, don't hesitate to email me. I don't think if there is, I can send it here also. If you have any questions further. And for the rest, thank you very much, Dominic, for making it possible as well. And yeah, I wish everybody a lovely evening, day, afternoon, wherever everybody is.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.